It started in a city that gave America some of its greatest voices. A place where gospel spilled out of church doors, where rhythm lived in basements, and where young singers learned early that music could be both a calling and a way out. Some names from that city became legends. Their stories were told, retold, and remembered. But one name quietly slipped through the cracks. His voice made audiences freeze, then erupt. His phrasing bent words until they stuttered with feeling. Other singers listened, some learned, some followed. One of them would become one of the greatest voices the world has ever known. Another admirer would later fill stadiums across the globe and still say, without hesitation, that this man was his favorite singer. Yet today, most people don't know his story. Not the brilliance, not the battles, and not the way his life ended too early, too suddenly, under circumstances that still leave questions hanging in the air. This is not just the story of a gifted musician. It's the story of talent without protection, of success shadowed by exploitation, and of a voice that deserved far more time than it was given. So the question is simple and unsettling. How does someone this influential disappear from history? Before the applause, before the records, before the expectations, there was a boy growing up in Washington, D.C., in a home where music was not entertainment. It was instruction. It was discipline. It was faith. He was born into a family where voices blended naturally and instruments were treated like extensions of the body. Church was not optional. It was central. The sound of gospel shaped his ears before the outside world ever did. By the age of 8, his mother had already placed him in front of a piano, guiding his hands, teaching him not just notes, but control, patience, feeling. By 12, he was no longer learning alone. He sang with his brothers, then with cousins. Harmonies became second nature. The group traveled from one church to another, one community event to the next, building something that felt small at the time but was quietly rare. They were consistent, polished, trusted. That consistency led somewhere unexpected. A weekly radio show. For 5 straight years, their voices went out over local airwaves. Not once, not occasionally, every week. In an era when access meant everything, that exposure mattered, people in Washington, D.C., began to recognize the sound before they recognized the face. But gospel was only part of the story. At home, he listened closely. He absorbed secular music the way some people study textbooks, jazz phrasing, swing timing, especially the freedom of scat singing. He admired the way a voice could improvise without losing emotional clarity. That influence would later surface in ways no one could miss. By the time he entered high school, his talent was no longer confined to church or radio. He entered local talent competitions and won. Not once, repeatedly. One performance stood out, a bold, controlled rendition of Summertime. It wasn't flashy, it was confident. It suggested something deeper than raw ability. It suggested direction. Washington, D.C. in those years was full of young singers chasing similar dreams. Some would later become famous. At the time, they were just kids competing on the same stages, learning what it meant to command attention without losing composure. Then came the basement. A legendary guitarist had moved into the city and built a studio beneath his home. Young artists gathered there, drawn by opportunity and proximity. Sessions ran late. Ideas moved fast. Voices blended. Futures quietly took shape. It was in that environment that he crossed paths with other young singers who would later define American soul music. They sang together, practiced together, learned from each other. No contracts, no guarantees, just sound and ambition in close quarters. Eventually, that voice, distinct, rhythmic, impossible to confuse with anyone else, stood out. And when an offer came to join a touring band and leave Washington behind, it wasn't just a career move. It was a crossing point, because once he left home, the music would change, and so would the stakes. Chicago changed everything. The clubs were louder, the expectations were heavier, and the music industry moved fast, whether an artist was ready or not. On stage, he stood behind a piano, commanding attention without forcing it. The phrasing was unusual, the rhythm unpredictable. Words bent, doubled, and stuttered by design. Audiences didn't always understand it, but they felt it. That difference mattered. Soon, the industry took notice. A solo contract followed, then records, then the realization that his sound didn't fit neatly into any single box. It wasn't pure blues. It wasn't traditional soul. It carried Caribbean movement, jazz freedom, and gospel intensity all at once. When the first releases reached listeners, the response was immediate. In Chicago, people embraced the voice. Beyond the city, the momentum grew slowly, but it grew honestly. Each record built recognition, not hype. He wasn't manufactured. He was revealed. Then came the breakthrough. I Do Love You didn't shout. It didn't beg. It spoke plainly, with restraint and warmth. The record climbed the charts, crossing boundaries between R&B and the mainstream. Radio stations that had never played his work before suddenly kept it in rotation. The song became familiar in living rooms, cars, and late-night broadcasts. Sitting in the Park followed, and with it, confirmation. This wasn't luck. This was presence. The voice felt conversational, almost intimate, as if the singer were sitting beside you rather than performing for you. Touring expanded his reach. The Apollo package tours with established stars. Night after night, the same reaction. Surprise, then excitement, then applause that lingered longer than expected. But the defining moment came with Summertime. The song was already a classic, untouchable, some believed. Yet his version reframed it completely. The phrasing was loose, the rhythm playful, the emotion unmistakable. It crossed over to pop charts and international audiences, reaching listeners who had never heard his name before. Suddenly, musicians were paying attention. Some admired the courage it took to reinterpret something sacred. Others listened closely, studying the phrasing, the confidence, the way he controlled space between words. Younger singers learned by listening. Older artists acknowledged the originality. Yet, even at the height of this success, something felt unstable. The applause was loud. The sales were real. But behind the scenes, questions lingered about ownership, about credit, about whether the rewards matched the contribution. On stage, he looked unstoppable. Off stage, the ground was already beginning to shift. Success did not bring peace. As his records climbed the charts, a different kind of tension settled in. It wasn't visible from the stage. It lived in contracts, conversations behind closed doors, and questions that never seemed to receive straight answers. Questions about ownership, about credit, about whether creative contribution truly mattered once the records were pressed and sold. The breaking point came with Summertime. He had reshaped the song, added his own phrasing, his own vocal architecture. The performance carried his fingerprint from start to finish. When the record crossed over and reached new audiences, he believed reasonably that his contribution deserved recognition beyond applause. Instead, he was dismissed. When he pressed the issue, the response was not clarification. It was humiliation. He was sent chasing an answer that led nowhere. Not to a negotiation table, not to a publisher's office, but to silence. The message was clear without being spoken. Ask fewer questions. For someone who valued respect as much as recognition, the damage ran deep. Friends noticed the shift. He was still magnetic on stage, but off stage, the edges sharpened. He felt watched, controlled, underestimated. Years of being laughed at for his weight. Years of fighting to be taken seriously. Years of watching others benefit while he was told to be grateful. The pressure accumulated, stories circulated, never glorified, never celebrated about confrontations and heated moments. They were not the acts of a reckless man chasing chaos. They were the reactions of someone who felt cornered, unheard, and repeatedly disrespected. The industry had little patience for anger unless it came from the right people. Health issues added another layer. His weight strained his body. Diabetes complicated long tours and long nights. Fatigue became constant. Recovery took longer. Yet the schedule didn't slow down. Then tragedy struck again. Members of his own band were lost in a devastating accident. The shock lingered. The silence afterward felt heavier than any crowd. The sense that time was running out, not metaphorically, but literally began to follow him. Still, he performed because stepping away felt impossible, because momentum, once built, demands motion, and because the stage was the only place where control returned, even briefly. But beneath the surface, the balance was gone. What once felt like ascent had become survival, and survival, under that kind of weight, rarely lasts forever. The night before, the work was done. The show had ended late. Applause faded. Equipment was packed. By early morning, the road called again. This was the rhythm of touring, sleep cut short, miles stacked back to back, responsibility outweighing rest. Just after sunrise, 2 vehicles left North Carolina, heading toward the next performance. One followed closely behind the other. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing suggested finality. Then, in a matter of seconds, everything changed. On Interstate 95, as the cars approached a bridge crossing the Neuse River, the lead vehicle suddenly lost control. Witnesses later described the violent shift, wheels wobbling, steering fighting back. The car struck the bridge, curbing, and plunged into the water below. There was no explosion, no dramatic fire, just a rapid descent into cold river water. Inside the vehicle were 4 men. None escaped. What unsettled the community wasn't only the loss, it was the setting. The river was not deep. The town was small. Help arrived, but slowly. Reports suggested it took hours to recover the car and the bodies. For many, the question formed quietly but persistently. Could this have ended differently? Soon, other details surfaced. The car was new, less than 2 weeks old. Family members recalled earlier problems, brakes that didn't respond, moments that nearly turned disastrous. Days before the accident, warnings had been given. Plans to fix the issue had been discussed. Too late. News spread quickly through the region. In towns unaccustomed to tragedy, disbelief settled in. For the music world, the shock was sharper. A voice still climbing. A career still unfolding. Gone at 32. In the years that followed, the search for answers moved from highways to courtrooms. A lawsuit against the manufacturer stretched across multiple trials. Arguments over mechanical failure, responsibility, and accountability filled transcripts where music once lived. Eventually, a settlement came, but closure did not, because no ruling could answer the question that lingered longest, not in court records, but in memory. What if the warning signs had been taken seriously? What if the road had been delayed just one day? What if the system had protected the artist instead of pushing him forward? America watched quietly as another gifted voice faded, not from lack of talent, but from a moment that arrived far too soon. Some stories don't end with applause. They end quietly, leaving behind unanswered questions and a sense that time was stolen rather than spent. When the news settled and the tours stopped, what remained was not just grief but absence, a space in the music where a voice should have continued to grow. In the years after his passing, recognition arrived slowly, too slowly to matter to the man himself. Inductions followed. Honors were announced. Documentaries revisited the past. His recordings resurfaced in films, samples, and late-night playlists. New listeners discovered the phrasing, the warmth, the control that had once felt so familiar to those who heard it firsthand. But legacy is not measured only by awards. It lives in influence, in the way other singers shape their delivery, in the courage it took to sound different in an industry that preferred obedience, in the quiet fact that some of the most celebrated voices of their generation listened closely to his work. The story also stands as a warning. Talent does not protect you. Success does not guarantee fairness, and systems rarely change unless they are forced to. He gave the world music that still breathes decades later, songs that don't age because they were never chasing trends. They were rooted in feeling, in honesty, in restraint. At his funeral, one of those songs played softly, a love song, simple, uncomplicated, the kind that doesn't beg to be remembered yet always is. Perhaps that is the truest measure of his impact. Not how loudly his name is spoken today, but how deeply his voice still settles when the needle drops. If this story reminded you of a moment, a voice, or an artist who never received their due, share that memory below. We read every comment, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be preserved, not rewritten, not rushed, consider staying with us. Because some voices leave the stage early, but they never really leave us.